One of the areas where Python truly shines is on the web. Many well-known websites like YouTube, Pinterest, and Spotify are powered by Python. In the mid-2000s, a number of powerful and popular web frameworks were created such as Django, Flask, and Pyramid. It may feel like the choices of web frameworks and innovation in that space is basically baked and done. But we're actually seeing an explosion of new frameworks because of some new web paradigms. In this episode, you'll meet Martijn Faassen, who created Morepath, a relatively new web framework built to be a first-class citizen of this JavaScript client-side heavy web paradigm that's popular in many apps today. This is Talk Python to Me, episode 99, recorded January 19th, 2017.
I'm a developer in many senses of the word, cause I make these applications, but I also use these verbs to make this music. I construct it line by line, just like when I'm coding another software design. In both cases, it's about design patterns. Anyone can get the job done, it's the execution that matters. I have many interests, sometimes conflict.
Welcome to Talk Python to Me, a weekly podcast on Python, the language, the libraries, the ecosystem, and the personalities. This is your host, Michael Kennedy. Follow me on Twitter where I'm at mkennedy. Keep up with the show and listen to past episodes at talkpython.fm and follow the show on Twitter via @talkpython. Martijn, welcome to Talk Python.
Hello.
I'm excited to have you here. I really love web development in Python, and I think web development in Python is actually one of the really early places that Python became super relevant. And we've seen it spread to other places really well, like data science is the most recent of these. But, at the heart, I think a lot of Python developers or web developers, when people ask me, hey, what do you do? And I don't want a long conversation. I just want a quick answer like, I write web apps. I'm a developer, something like this. So I love web apps. And I think it's really cool, even though there are many Python web apps around, that you've created a new one relatively recently within the last couple of years. So I'm excited to talk to everyone about Morepath. Before we do, though, let's hear your story. How did you get into Python and programming?
Well, programming I've been doing since I was a child, trying to create games in BASIC on various computers. First at my father's office, because we had no computer at home, and then later on home computers.
What was that first computer?
The very first computer that I remember using, I think that's actually the very first computer I used, was called a Triumph Adler, which is, I don't know what kind of brand that is. It was a CP/M machine. And then after that, moved to early PCs, or Olivetti M24s are the ones I recall, also being very early. And my home computer was an MSX2, which was C80 based and more popular in Japan and Europe than the United States.
Okay, and you started out originally just poking around on these things and did you try to write some games?
Yes, like I imagine many programmers tried to write some games, very simple things.
I think it's interesting, like people really want to get into it and write games, and games are some of the hardest types of software to write. Yeah,
it used to be easier, I think, back then, because even mobile phone games are more complicated than the games that were commercial back then. But even there are a lot of sort of details like real-time requirements and things like that you don't really have so much in other contexts.
Yeah, absolutely. So where'd you go from there? Playing around with it at home? Did you study computer science in university or where?
Yeah, I did something more artificial intelligence oriented, but that's a very long time ago. But I had some courses, various languages, Lisp, Prolog, taught myself C. I had a Pascal course. I did some work with Delphi for a while back in the 90s. And then I was programming in C++, was writing this artificial life simulation. And then I heard about scripting languages, read an article in some magazine at some point that listed Perl and Tcl and Python, maybe one or two others. And I basically just wanted to write some tools that could help me manage my C++ code base. And I looked at Perl because that was sort of the obvious candidate at the time, and it was on my computer, and messed around with it for a while, and I could see how that would be a useful language. Like, it had made things like data types really easy, but it never quite clicked in my brain. Then I remember printing out the Python tutorial from python.org, and I read it one evening before sleeping, and the next day I was a Python programmer.
That's awesome. I'm sure it's one day, right? I've done this as well, but it's been very, very long that I printed, I remember printing 100 pages of source code in C++ trying to understand some application, and printed it and took it with me because I was going away somewhere for the summer and I didn't have a computer with me the whole summer. The world has changed so much, right?
Yes. This was just without a computer for during the evening, but I just had printed out the tutorial. And then a few weeks later, I actually managed to get a job writing Python code in 1998, which was
awesome.
Kind of surprised myself. But I was at it was actually the veterinary department of Dutch University in Utrecht, and they were looking for somebody who would clean up some script that had fallen apart that was written in some combination of DOS batch files and dbase code, and they wanted me to rewrite it. And I said, can I use Python? And they said, what's that? And I said, well, that's a programming language. And is it readable? I said, yes, it's very readable. And, which is really what they were looking for. And then I found myself having a job writing Python code, which then quickly sort of moved into the web as well. I started, that was 98 as Zope was released as an open source a product back in 98 as well. So I started playing around with that and then moved into web development from there.
That's cool. Yeah. That first week or two of the job where you're just like, what am I doing here? I can't believe they just hired me. I just barely know this.
Well, I mean, I guess I just been playing with Python for a few weeks, I guess, but I just clicked in my brain so much that I thought, okay, this is the right tool for the job. And it was sort of more or less a scripting job anyway, so that fit. And I remember I was reading Complex Python, the Python news group, and people were saying, oh, I wish I had a Python job and I'm stuck here programming in this other language. That it looks really unrealistic to get a real Python job, back then those were very rare. And then I was like, hey, I actually have a Python job, and I didn't even particularly look for one. I just had one, so I was lucky. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really lucky. I still hear that from people today that, they're working in some other technology, but they play with Python at home and they're looking to get there. So that's really cool.
Yeah, it's everywhere though now. I mean, Python, it's really a different world. I remember Python, I had to explain to everybody what Python was. I mean, even other software developers. And these days, I don't have to do that anymore. It's really everywhere. Yeah.
There's some stats, somebody that did a study recently analyzing active, non-trivial GitHub repositories, which was something like they have 10K lines of code, 10K's worth of file content, and they've been updated within the last year. And if you take that in there, Python is the number 2 most popular language on GitHub behind JavaScript, which I think is overcounted. So it's definitely a different world.
Yes. And there's just lots of commercial projects that use Python in one or another way that don't even show up on GitHub as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So you talked about Zope and some of the thinking of the successors a little bit, like Pyramid and whatnot. It seems to me like those were kind of inspirations in your new web project because you reference them somewhat positively in your documentation and things like that.
Sure. Yeah. No, I started with Zope in 98 and I was very involved with it until I think even up to about 2010. I was even a chairman of the Zope Foundation for a few years. And Zope was really a killer app for Python in a way because there are a lot of as you mentioned, web development was an early thing for Python, though I think data science was there very early as well. But the conferences, like the early EuroPythons and the International Python conference that I went to even before then, a lot of the people there were there because of Zope. That's how they were attracted to the conference and to Python. So it drew in a lot of people, similarly to, I imagine, Django does now. Zope was a web framework before we even had a word for that, because web framework only arose as a concept later. So it was called a web application server, I believe.
And these frameworks were extracted out of let's build this web app. Oh, and actually there's some kind of framework we could almost use here, right? In that sense.
Zope was actually, it was a very strange beast. And in part it's because there was no normal beast out there at the time because everybody was exploring. and in part it's because it was enormously creative. What it had was a web-based user interface, which doesn't sound very amazing now, because lots of things do, but back then that's kind of unusual for web application development framework. And through that you would add templates, and later on you could add little pieces of Python code. And then it sort of slowly morphed into doing more and more sort of larger scale Python projects using Zope's plugin architecture. And fairly quickly we were dissatisfied with Zope's plugin architecture, and then this whole Zope 3 project emerged, which was sort of intending to rewrite Zope and make it all better and create the future paradise. And while we created a lot of interesting technology and we learned a lot, and I actually built some real applications with Zope 3, it never really took off because we sort of overshot in the other direction, as you tend to get.
Yeah, you rarely make one rash decision. It's usually swing back the other way, right? Like, it's just, I see that all the time in technology, that people have some kind of monolithic thing and they're like, oh, we're going to fix this, we're going to make it extensible, you can enable, disable, etc. Yes. And then it just becomes like, well, wait, this is no longer easy to use. I liked it because it was easy, and now it's like there's 100 choices and it's hard to fix when it's broken and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, the early Zope was never really easy if you were going to build a larger Python-based project with it, but if you just wanted to write something quick, sort of using the web user interface, then yeah, it was very easy. And yeah, I actually spent time in making the Zope 3 technology available in Zope 2. So I created this little glue framework that I called 5, which is what inspired the Python name for 6. The name 5 was already taken, so they multiplied 2 and 3.
Yeah, oh, that's cool. I didn't know you were behind that. Yeah.
So I'm not behind 6, but 2 plus 3 was already taken, so they had to go to 6 instead of 5.
Nice. Yeah, you already had the package name, so that solved that debate.
That technology is still in use inside of the Blown CMS to this very day. And then what I did in 2006 is actually started together with a bunch of other people, but sort of I kicked off that project, the Croc Web Framework, which was based on the Zope 3 technology, but tried to put a friendlier face on it, also inspired by sort of the new wave of web frameworks that had been coming then.
Right, that's like Flask and Django time. Yeah, Ruby.
Flask was not around yet, but yeah, Ruby on Rails and Django were new at the time.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So we tried to do something like that. So with Croc, we had some sort of moderate success because it sort of benefited also from the larger Zope community. People did start using it. And it was a lot easier to start a new web framework project back in 2006 than it is in 2013.
Yeah, the expectations were way lower of what a web framework had to be, right? It didn't have to be as polished, and the web itself was simpler, right?
I think the web itself was simpler, but I think the main thing that I think has changed a lot is documentation. Back then you could start a new web framework and have some documentation, but not really exhaustive documentation or very good documentation, and still get some traction. And these days that's a lot harder, I think. The web was simpler, but the basics of Ajax, I remember I implemented those early on in Croc as well, so that hasn't changed all that much in some ways. But of course, client-side development was still very different. There wasn't as much of it going around back then.
Yeah, it was much, much smaller scale. I mean, maybe jQuery was around then. I don't even remember the time. Maybe not. I think it was.
Yeah, I remember. I think I used MochiKit for a while, but yeah, I don't know whether jQuery is around yet.
But definitely not Angular, JS, and a lot of those types of things, right?
No, I did a framework there as well. I just keep creating stuff.
You do create a lot of frameworks, I know.
Yeah, because I can't help myself. So back in, I think around 2010, it was just before all those client-side frameworks started emerging. I thought, I have a great idea. I'll take my experience from server-side frameworks like templates and models and views and things like that, and I'll take some of those ideas and then see what happens when I use them on the client. So I created this JavaScript framework called Obvial, which was based around jQuery, but allowed you to create views, view components for little bits of JSON that could identify themselves with a type, and then it would look up the appropriate view for it, and then you could just basically render a tree of client-side components driven by the server. And just around that time, Backbone emerged, and then Angular, and then all the others. And then I thought, okay, yeah, it was a good idea, but I just because other people are having the same idea. And I was definitely an idea ripe for its time to take some of these server framework concepts and move them to the client. So OVL didn't get any traction, but I did learn a lot from creating it, which helped me.
Oh, that's cool. It was absolutely the time. Yeah, it was definitely the time when there was a lot of evolution and creation around that kind of stuff. There still is, but it was like every month you'd hear about something that's going to change the world as you know it, right?
It's still changing quite rapidly. People complain about JavaScript fatigue, but I kind of like it because I like the creativity around it. Yeah, and I can say I'm a client-side web framework hipster because I was doing that before it was cool.
Definitely doing it before it was cool.
Yes.
Very, very interesting. So let's talk about your project Morepath. One of the things, I watched a nice talk from you at EuroPython in 2014, and I'll be sure to link to the video. And one of the things you started out talking about was, why would one go and create a new web framework when Flask, Django, Pyramid, and lots more exist already?
Yes, and that's basically because I can't help myself. It's just a creative urge. I mean, of course, there are reasons why I created one. I had a customer at the time who wanted something that could do REST APIs really well and was small enough to plug into a larger application. So I could have used an existing framework for it, but I said, what if I just take some ideas I already have, and I had some pieces of code lying about, and I just put them together and I'll create a little framework. And that's where Morepath came from. And it's still a relatively small framework. It hasn't grown that much.
Yeah, you describe it as a micro framework, and it seems certainly like it fits well in there. It seems like somewhere between Bottle and Flask, maybe.
I cheat a little bit because Morepath, the core itself, is just a couple of thousand lines of code. It's built on top of this predicate dispatch library called Reg, which I also created, which is just 500 lines of code, I think. But then I spun off another library from Morepath called Dectate, which is a configuration, Python sort of decorator configuration library that Morepath then uses to implement its directives. And that's also some, hundreds of lines of code as well. So, you can still be micro if you depend on a few libraries that you're also maintaining. But nonetheless, it's still pretty small. I think it's about the size of Flask or so. Depends a little bit on what you count. If you count the template language implementation, or you count the request response implementation, which is WebOp in case of Morepath. That's how do you add up these things? How many lines of code is a micro framework? But yes, it's small. Yes.
Yeah, in my mind, micro framework is more about the exposed feature set and how much I have to learn to work with it, more than whether it's 1,000 or 2,000 lines or whatever.
That's true. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, and in that sense, I feel like your framework is something you can pick up pretty quickly, and you can kind of understand a good portion of it.
Yes.
Pretty quickly. So let's talk about the goals first. Like, what were the goals of this project?
So one of the things that I had been doing with Croc is I started using, so I have to go back to Zope again. Zope and also Croc use this database called the ZDB, the Zope Object Database, which is a pretty nice object store for Python. You can just put in any almost arbitrary Python object, hook it up to another Python object just as an attribute, and as long as there's some path to a root object, then everything gets persisted automatically for you. That makes it really flexible because you can just basically store any kind of Python object to represent any model that you'd like.
It sounds like a kind of early concept of what document databases became.
Yeah, I mean, it's very tied to Python, which is both its strength and its weakness, because, if you change your class, then suddenly the instances need to be updated. But it used to be very hard to explain, because when you said database in the late 90s, early 2000s, people just assumed you were talking about a relational database with SQL on it, and there was nothing really else that people were familiar with. And then NoSQL happened, and then it became a lot easier to explain.
It's like a hipster NoSQL database, because it was NoSQL before there was NoSQL also.
Yes,
Interesting.
Yes. I mean, that makes some things very easy, but I needed to integrate a relational database with Croc. And one of the nice features about the Zope Object Database is that you can you can vary, we have to go back to the Zope publisher. Zope has this sort of publisher that's based on traversal. So you just traverse a Python object. So if you have a path A/B/C, to resolve that to an object and then call a method on that object to represent it as HTML or JSON or whatever, it would basically just do a lot of get attr and get item into the object tree. So you would just get attribute A from the root, and then you would get item B from the item that you just got, and then you ask for get item from that object, and you get another object, and then you call its represent me as HTML method on it. So that's how Zope worked, and the nice feature of that is that it also allows you to construct URLs really well, because you can retrace the path that you took. So if you have an object like a document and you want its URL, you just can construct it automatically. So I like that feature of object database and traversal. So then with Croc, I wanted to integrate a relational database, and I was using SQL Alchemy, but I wanted to retain that feature. And then first I sort of tried to coax SQL Alchemy to become a traversable tree. And while SQL Alchemy, it being very flexible, made that possible, it didn't really fit the models very well, and to have to adjust the models just so you can actually traverse to it with URL paths didn't really work very well. So then I had this idea, okay, I'll do it another way. I'll create a routing framework, but one with the property that you route not to a view but to the model, just like I was used to from the ZDB. And also I have the property that you can take instance of a class that is in the routing system and ask for a link to it, and then it will just construct it automatically from the routing information that it has.
Right. So you could do something like, if you had, say, like a customer, let's say, your routing URL might look like something like /customers/7.
Sure.
It might know that, okay, well, that 7 actually corresponds to the customer ID. And then you have you have decorators that will indicate, like, well, here's the function that you call to actually do that query and represent it however it's going to be represented.
Yes, right? Yes, that's how it works in Morepath. In Croc, it still had a slightly different sort of, there were no decorators, but otherwise, yeah, that's more or less the principle. So to resolve something, you first look up the model instance, you first do your query, or you construct some kind of Python instance, you return this from a function that's connected to the route. And then after that, you look up a view function for it, and it can do this based on the class or what you just found and information in the request and things like that. So it can find this view function, and then the view function gets the request and also the instance that you just returned from the path function, and then you do your rendering in there. And that has the nice property that you can link to any class that you expose to that routing system.
Do you like register documents or type entities? You say these are the entities that you might be able to go to?
I just whatever models my views need. So in some cases those are backed by a relational database like a customer, and in some case I need to create a model that represents, for instance, a collection, which is not really backed directly by a relational database, but you can implement it in terms of queries as well, and then you just attach views to that collection class. So yeah, with Croc I figured this out, and then with Morepath I sort of took that idea and cleaned it up and made that sort of one of the central principles of the web framework. And I think sort of besides the easy linking, which was for sort of the primary motivation, I think it also really helps structuring code. With other web frameworks, you see some kind of get this object from the database, or if you can get it, do a 404 error kind of convenience function. And if you don't use that convenience function, you have to watch for a failure to find the object. And if you do so, you have to remember to raise a 404 error yourself. And with Morepath, because it has more knowledge about being able to find the model or not, it's not hidden inside of a view function like you would have in Flask or Django.
Right. And if you screw that up in, let's say, Flask, you probably get like a none type does not have like whatever property you're looking for error, right?
Yeah, you get a 500. Yeah, you're getting a 500 error.
And that surfaces as, cannot process requests 500, which always gives people confidence in your application.
Yes.
Yeah.
It turns out that if you have to write that boilerplate code anyway in your application, it almost doesn't cost anything anymore to just write a separate function to separate it into two stages. And you get other features from that as well. You can do permission checks also, because you have an idea of the instance that is being represented. So you can say, okay, well, customers are only accessible, views for customers are only accessible if you have a certain permission, and you can actually make sort of the concept of customer play a part in your authorization system as well. That sort of all these, because you constrain yourself to really route to a model instance first and then to a view. You get from that constraint, the framework can benefit and build on top of it.
Let me take just a moment and tell you about Metis, a sponsor of this episode. A data scientist's responsibilities can range far and wide. How can you be sure you have the necessary skills and training to enter the field or keep up with emerging technologies? Metis, a data science training company based in New York City, San Francisco, Chicago, and Seattle, provides full-time immersive boot camps, evening part-time professional development courses, online resources, and corporate programs, all with a goal of training you to become a data scientist and help you stay on top of new and necessary skills. Metis has a long list of professional development courses starting soon in any of these 4 cities, taught by industry leaders. Interested in honing your skills? Then these courses are for you. How do they work? Courses on topics like data visualization, deep learning with TensorFlow, machine learning, and statistical foundations run 2 nights a week for 6 weeks during the evening hours that fit into your busy schedule. These courses are laser focused on relevant topics and skills that are sure to enhance your career. They have a special offer for you at thisismetis.com/talkpython. Be sure to check out what they're offering. It helps support the show. Sounds to me like you focused very heavily on RESTful type of ideas, right? Like the routing framework assumes that there's some kind of resource or model at the end, and you can use like get to do default queries on it and things like that.
Yeah, one of the sort of the basic ideas behind Morepath when I started developing it is to be good at doing REST. It turned out that actually, a framework that's good at doing REST actually is also pretty good at doing traditional server-side web applications as well that do generate HTML. Those things are not in conflict with each other at all. But yeah, the initial goal was to do REST well, and actually template language implementation took, I think, 1.5 years or so until I finally got around to doing that.
Okay, so some of the origins was almost to make this something that you can serve up almost static HTML with rich JavaScript that reaches back to the server for all sorts of data and whatnot.
Yeah, because I had been developing, even with Oviel, I had been developing that way. So I had some ideas of what I wanted my framework to be able to do, also from the client side perspective. And one of the things that I sort of always have been is I try to actually do real REST. These days, REST, the term has become so eroded that it basically just means, it means endpoints that the client just needs to know about, and it returns some kind of data format, but it doesn't involve linking or anything like that. So I always actually try to do and work with real REST, where your JSON data structures also include links to other structures, so sort of the other endpoints, and that you can sort of enter your application with one root endpoint and then find sort of all the links and follow them, and perhaps also embed objects if you want to get.
To me, REST has become a synonym for HTTP-based services.
Yes.
Usually that return JSON. But I think the two things that are often neglected that you are hinting at is one is content type negotiation. And the other is the dynamic linking and discovery, right? You request an original resource and it tells you like how you can continue to explore the service. Morepath has good support for content type negotiation, right?
Well, actually, that's a thing I have cared less about. So it's actually, we do have a really powerful system which allows you to build that should you want to, but I haven't seen a lot of people actually try.
Yeah.
So the idea that if you request HTML, you'll get HTML from the same URL as where if you request JSON, then you'll get JSON, or perhaps you have multiple versions of your API that are sort of negotiated that way. In practice, I haven't seen a lot myself yet. That doesn't mean very much.
Sure, but you can go to like a view and say at app.json, at app.html, and things like that, right? Like theoretically.
Yes. what you can do is you can name multiple views, and then you can do, well, it's not negotiation, but you can just say, okay, I want a different version of this, or a different view entirely, actually, because views are looked up by the class of the model, but also by the request method, and also by the name of the view, which is the last part of the path. If it's there, you can use an @ sign. And you can also look up views if they have a body. You can actually interpret somehow the post body if it's JSON, and then switch to a different view if you post something else. Just have it dispatched to a different function. And that whole system is extensible, so you could just write a new directive and add more criteria for your views in your own application. And it's actually possible to have, in the same runtime, to have one application that uses more criteria than another one, and they will just live next to each other because of Morepath configuration system. So you can add stuff that looks at the accept header. That's pretty easy to implement sort of in a basic case, but if you want to do full accept header support, it tends to get a little bit hairy because there's a lot of different possibilities there.
I find, yeah, right, that's a very rarely used feature of services. Usually people say, go to this URL, do a get, and you're going to get JSON or something like that, you know?
Yeah, because the information is encoded in URL, right? You can just see it. And if you suddenly have to worry about content types that you do the request with, it becomes a lot harder to sort of get an idea in your head of what's going on.
Yeah, for sure. So one of the things that you talk about that I thought was cool, and you even had some nice hand-drawn pictures
nice, yes.
in your presentation, yeah.
Yeah.
And one was like a web framework and embodied as a person pulling their like dress shirt open, and there's like a Morepath Superman type of suit underneath. And you talk about the superpowers of Morepath. Do you want to touch on those a little?
Right. So some of them I've touched on already, but one of the superpowers I would say is the dispatch system. So the view dispatch system, but it's also used in other areas, like this authorization system uses it, for instance, allows you to write Python functions that dispatch on not just one argument like you have normally in Python with a method. It dispatches on self, at least you can look at it that way. So the class of the self argument of a method with the same name determines which actual method gets called. You can also dispatch on other arguments as well, and not just its class, but also other attributes of those arguments. And that allows the view system to dispatch on the class of the model, the request methods, get, put, post of the request, the view name, which is also stored on the request, the last part of the path. But also if the accept header, or the type of the JSON body that you submit, or whatever else you come up with.
Yeah, I can tell linking is super important in this whole routing, and linking is really a key part of what you're trying to focus on.
Right, but yeah, this is the dispatch system.
Okay.
That's not the linking or the routing system. It allows you to write views that can be really general, work for, any subclass of a particular base class, or be really specific for a specific class as well. And you can dispatch of a lot of different factors. So that's the reg bit.
Yeah. There's almost like an inheritance thing that you can do with that stuff, right?
Yes.
You can kind of override a view in a specialized class. Okay, gotcha.
Yes. It's like basically, if you just look at the model bit of how you register views, it's very much like you define methods, but you don't define them inside of the class. You define them just as functions outside of the class, and your decorator says where they belong. But basically, that's just one factor of what it does to look up with. And authorization also works that way. It's like, do I have this particular permission for this particular model instance? And then it can also know about inheritance. So you can be very specific about, this subclass needs to have a different permission rule than everything else. And that's reg. Then there is the automatic link generation I already talked about, which I think is really neat. And most frameworks don't really do it. They do it sort of halfway, where you say, okay, well, you need to give all your routes a name. You need to come up with a name and remember that and maintain that. And then when you want to generate a link from your Python code or your template or whatever, you need to use the special API or do this special thing. And then you need to give it all the variables that are needed to construct the link again. So you need to know still what those things are, whether that's the ID or whatever the link construction is based on.
Yeah, and that usually appears in multiple places. There's usually like some configuration thing where you define the route for the URL dispatch, and then there's the actual template where you put the thing, and you have to know, okay, I have to replace these two parts of the URL with this part of data. And then in your actual view, you've got to pull that data out of the route data that was passed, and it's at least in 3 places.
Yeah. So you have to do that, and if you have multiple places where you link to the same thing, you have to do it sort of in multiple places. And that also makes the code less generic, because suddenly it's dependent on sort of the particular structure of what you're linking to. And if you were to change that, then you would have to change all the templates that link to it.
Yeah, everything breaks. And so what I do on my web apps is on my model, I will use like some kind of rich class and then convert it to a dictionary at sort of render time. But I'll put like a method like, here's the function or the property that gets me the URL with all the pieces filled in. And so I'll go in like template and say, dot like purchase URL or whatever. But
exactly.
You kind of bake this concept directly into Morepath in a sense, right?
Yes. So that it's that concept, but then you don't have to burden your classes, your model classes, with information about the web, which is basically, it's a reasonable compromise. I see Django. You can also do it with Django. There's a convention there as well. It's still, why would my model class know about URLs? That's the whole point about a routing framework, is to not have to worry about that kind of stuff in the model classes.
Exactly. You look at the standard MVC design pattern. There's an arrow from down to the model, but there's no arrows back from the model, right? Which is like basically what I'm proposing, right? That it knows how to get back to these things.
Yeah, and Morepath knows how to do that, but the information is stored outside of the model classes themselves.
Nice.
In the configuration system. But that allows generic code as well. If you have a list of objects and you just want to create a list of links to it, and those objects might be in completely different places in your website. If you were to solve that you could solve it if you again burden your model with this get URL method, then you can do it. But without that, you would have to use a lot of special cases in your template or whatever to create the right link. So Morepath does that for you. It gets the information that it needs from the models. By default, just there's a convention that the name that you use in the route is the name of the attribute, but you can override that to reconstruct it. So that's really powerful. And then there's the configuration system. So Morepath has an actual sort of thought through configuration system as an entity by itself, which should not be that unusual for web frameworks, but it actually is. And what I mean with the configuration system is the system that lets you express things like, okay, well, this route exists and this view exists, and I have this permission to access that view, or I want to install a middleware that sits between the request and the handler and the response and sort of can interfere in there. Or I have a template rendering engine that I want to plug in. All those things I consider to be configuration, and that's really my Zope history speaking, because in Zope 3, that was one of the big innovations. We created this XML-based configuration language called ZCML, where you would express all of this in XML files, which sounded really cool at the time. But one of the things that I did...
You just put this namespace here on this XML element that it'll like, oh, yeah. Just kidding.
Oh, yeah. Well, you would just have an XML, a little XML language that was namespace, of course, where you would say, okay, well, you did have routes, but you would say this view has this permission, and if you, there were all kinds of things that could be configured. You would have adapters and things like that, but that's all pretty low-level stuff. But also services like, the service that can send email is here. So if the application asks for it, just look at the configuration basically for the service that can send email. That kind of pattern you tend to see a lot in larger applications that need to be customized in different contexts, like a CMS, for instance.
This portion of Talk Python to Me is brought to you by Hired. Hired is the platform for top Python developer jobs. Create your profile and instantly get access to 3,500 companies who will work to compete with you. Take it from one of Hired's users who recently got a job and said, I had my first offer on Thursday after going live on Monday, and I ended up getting 8 offers in total. I've worked with recruiters in the past, but they've always been pretty hit and miss. I tried LinkedIn, but I found Hired to be the best. I really liked knowing the salary up front. Privacy was also a huge seller for me. Sounds awesome, doesn't it? Well, wait until you hear about the sign-in bonus. Everyone who accepts a job from Hired gets a $1,000 sign-in bonus. And as TalkPython listeners, it gets way sweeter. Use the link hired.com/TalkPython to me, and Hired will double the sign-in bonus to $2,000. Opportunities knocking. Visit hired.com/TalkPython to me and answer the door.
What I did with Croc is already try to merge that back into Python so you could express it. Well, we didn't really have class decorators at the time, and function decorators were very new, so we did it in another way. But you can express it inside of Python code, and then with Morepath I express it with decorators. And all those decorators are attached to classes, application classes, subclasses of the Morepath application, that allows you to, the B classes you could inherit. So you can say if you want to inherit all the configuration of a particular base class and then override specific bits of configuration like one view or added piece of middleware or whatever, you could just do that with subclassing, and then you add your configuration to the subclass, and then your base class still has the original configuration. So if you were to run that behind a WSGI server, it would still behave as it did originally, but your subclass has the new, if you instantiate that, you get a WSGI app, and that will have the new behavior. And that's really powerful. And then what's also powerful is that you can actually compose those little applications together into a larger one. So Morepath allows you to mount applications onto other applications, which all could have their complete different configuration. They could even override some very basic behavior of Morepath and run in the same runtime.
Sure. So give me some examples of like what 2 or more applications might look like. How do they work together? What's a practical story there?
Well, so for instance, if you wanted to develop something like a GitHub where you have projects could have issue trackers, and you also have a wiki perhaps in a project. Now those issue trackers and wikis could be implemented as separate applications that don't know anything about projects or each other. So you could configure them with their own routes and views and things like that. And then you can mount them together onto the project application should you want to use the wiki and the issue tracker there. But if you wanted to mount them somewhere else in a completely different project, you wanted to use the wiki, you could mount it there. And in the mounting, the act of mounting, you define sort of how to translate from the sort of the outer applications set of concepts to the, for instance, find the ID of the wiki app or whatever, to find the wiki in the database. So they're really isolated from each other, but you can combine them with composition. And then, if you have a customer that likes the wiki and it's all perfect, but just wants to tweak this one little thing, in their deployment, then you could subclass the wiki and change it in that one little way. Hopefully your wiki will let you do that. That's still up to the design of the application. But yeah, that kind of sort of feature is something that I was used to from Zope 3, and Pyramid is the other Python web framework that has this kind of capability, though it does not have the mounting system. I don't believe Pyramid allows you to run multiple configurations in the same application, but I might be wrong.
Sure, you might have to just merge it.
But at least it has this notion of configuration, override, extension, that kind of thing. And Morepath tries to let you do that while also being really simple to use. So you just, you have application classes and you can subclass them.
Sure, that's really cool. So instead of having one big monolithic app, you could write a bunch of small apps and then sort of glue them together.
Yes.
Okay, that's really cool. You have a couple of ways to get started. Like if I want to get started with Morepath, like what are the few steps? Obviously pip install Morepath, then what?
Well,
do you have scaffolding?
Yeah, we have a cookie cutter template out there now. It's in the documentation. So you could use that. And then you get set up with a slightly bigger Morepath application. I've been resistant sort of to doing something like this for quite a while, because I find that if you do a lot of scaffolding, it sort of becomes tempting to put generate a lot of code basically when your project starts. And then I always think, okay, why is that not a library? Why is that not configuration-wise, there's so much sort of stuff that gets generated just to get an application going.
Yeah, I think that, Django sort of has that, right? In
Yes.
the sense that people think Django is huge, but you can actually create like a one-file, simple Django app. It's just nobody does it, so it feels larger, I think, in some sense. I think also Django is larger in other senses, but I believe...
No, yeah, it is larger, but it has its ORM and a template language and a lot of other things. But
and I think Pyramid suffers from this as well, in that it feels really big because when you create it, there's so many pieces. I don't necessarily mind that, but I think that's a message that it does send, right?
It's a different philosophy, I think, and both of them have their benefits. So Pyramid, I think, really tries to keep a lot of options open and to be sort of a little toolkit that you can use in very different ways, with a Z2B, with a relational database, with routing, with traversal. Sort of it has all those different options, and it tries to be pretty neutral about sort of what the way that you pick is. And that's useful, but with Morepath, I try to be a little bit more opinionated. I mean, it's still a micro framework. You can still do a lot of different things. But I do say, okay, there's routing and you route the models. There's no traversal. There's no routing to views. You could plug in the object database. It's completely database agnostic, but it tries to be a bit more opinionated about some bits.
Right.
In the hopes that also makes it more approachable so that, basic application is not so much heavy lifting.
Sure. I think opinionated has been the success of Ruby on Rails. It's been the success of Django to some degree. So it's not necessarily bad.
No, opinionated is not bad, but it's sort of a tricky balance between being a micro framework and being flexible, but still being opinionated. But, if you're going to be a framework, you have to have some opinions, because otherwise there's no point in at all, right? You're a framework. You're supposed to guide people in one direction or another. And Pyramid does have opinions. It has opinions about the configuration system, about these uses the SOAP component architecture to put things together, and those things are pretty fundamental to its use.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a place in Morepath where I can plug in some kind of middleware. Like, what are the options for that? There are many things I can choose from and wire together.
There's a tween system, and I just took that term and the concept from Pyramid. I stole a lot of ideas from Pyramid and Chris McDonough, because he went there first, right? He was coming from Zope, and then he thought, okay, I'm going to do it better. And then he was very successful doing that. And then I thought, okay, well, let's try as well, see where I end up.
Sure. So tell people about what tweens are in case they don't know.
It's a slightly higher level abstraction of what a WSGI middleware is. A WSGI middleware is a little bit too low level because WSGI is very low level, but a tween is a function that takes a request object and calls some kind of handler, which is your application or another tween that's sitting below, that returns a response object. And because you have this function that you plug in, you can do stuff to the request just before it goes into the handler, or you can do stuff to the response just before it comes out of the handler. And that allows you to do all kinds of neat stuff like commit transactions, or to do stuff to the HTML that comes out of the system, or whatever.
Right. Like I think Rollbar is a tween in Pyramid, and you can install it, and anytime there's a 500 error, it'll capture all these details and send that off, and all you got to do is like pyramid.include rollbar middleware name. It's like pyramid.contrib.rollbar or some variation of that name.
Yeah, Django also has its own middleware system, which is very similar. With Morepath, it plays sort of into the configuration system, though of course only the outer application, mounted applications, they all share the same middleware of the outer application. But with inheritance, it allows you to basically make available a Morepath application that has some middleware installed, and then if you subclass that, then that middleware is there as well for you, so you don't have to know very much to use middleware. And you can also configure a middleware to go on top of that or just under it, and then Morepath takes care of doing the sorting so that everything happens in the way you specified, if it's possible at all, of course.
Sure, of course. Okay, yeah, very nice. What kind of templates are supported? Like, do you have Chameleon? Do you have Jinja 2?
Yes, a Chameleon, Jinja 2, and Mako, I believe.
Okay, yeah, those seem to
bunch of plugins. They're not out of the box. You just need to install the template dependency, more.chameleon or more.jinja2, etc. And then you just subclass from a base class that those packages expose, and then you have that template language available. So then when you use that extension, those particular extensions, for like .pt for Chameleon and .jinja2, I believe, for Jinja2, then it will just render using that template language. You could even use both in the same app if you wanted to.
Yeah, and one of the other types that you have is just straight up JSON, right? You can just put a decorator say, this thing renders as JSON. It just converts directly.
Yeah, then you just return a Python structure that can be serialized to JSON.
Okay, excellent. What's the deployment story? Like, this is just a straight up WSGI application, so I can put it on MicroWSGI backed by Nginx or GUnicorn or whatever I want, right?
Yes. If you take the application class and you instantiate it, then you get a WSGI application and you could just hook it into whatever you like.
Okay, excellent. How about Python 3 versus Python 2? What's the status of the various versions?
Well, we support both. We have for some years now. For Morepath, that's fairly simple. For Reg, there's a few very dark corners of Python that we have to be aware of. But yeah, both are supported.
Okay, yeah, excellent. It's good to see lots of projects supporting Python 3 these days. Nice to hear that one does.
Yeah, if it's easier for libraries than for applications. So if you have a test suite, that's pretty comprehensive. It's pretty doable.
Okay, excellent. So you're also involved in some other projects, and we're getting kind of the end of the show. So maybe we just really quickly say what they are, and then one or two sentences about them. Don't want to go deep on it, but just to let people know the other projects that you've worked on. So we talked about Zope and Grok already, and Ovil, Morepath, but you've also done some stuff with LXML, right?
Yeah, I created the LXML years ago. I've been messing around with XML and Python. XML was way cool back in 2000.
Oh, I remember.
So I messed around with Python and XML, and I tried to write my own DOM implementation a few times and created sort of a start of an XPath implementation at one point. And it was all very interesting, and I learned a lot, but none of them sort of became anything very useful. And then at one point, I had already worked with the libxml2 library, which is this really fast, very featureful XML library, and libxlt on top of that, written in C. And they had Python bindings, but they really sucked because it was like programming C in Python. So if you were initialize something wrong, then you get a seg fault in Python. And if you forget to free something, you would just get a memory leak in Python. And those things are not something you want from a Python library. So I decided, okay, let's be minimally ambitious and build on top of this libxml2 library because it's really fast. And try to create a Pythonic API, and also not invent a Pythonic API for XML, because Frederick Land already had done that. He created Elementary, and there wasn't any C Elementary at the time, just Elementary. So what I did is, okay, let's create an Elementary API with extensions for XSLT and XPath and all those things on top of libxml2. So that's what I did. That actually is quite tricky because of trying to do garbage collect C objects that can be in tree shape to each other, and things that can be separated from each other, but maybe there's all kinds of sort of interesting details there. And I used a technology called Pyrex at the time, but it's now been renamed to Cython. So I was a very early adopter of Pyrex because I didn't want to write all that C code myself.
Yeah.
And then one of the best things in my open source career sort of happened. So I worked on LXML for maybe a year or so, and I got sort of it working, and it was doing garbage collection, and there was an Elementary API, and it was all working pretty nicely. And then this German guy, Stefan Benel, he started sending me lots and lots of patches and all kinds of enhancements and features and things like that. And I was busy. I couldn't really keep track of all the patches. And then I made the conscious decision at one point. I remember it being the end of the year at one point, and I mailed him and I said, now you're co-maintainer of the project. You can do whatever you like. So I gave him that power and responsibility. And that was a very good move, because he's been maintaining LXML since then, which is more than 10 years now, and added lots of features and improvements and things to it. And he also descended down the stack because he ran into Pyrex because I was using that, and he wanted to improve that as well. And in the end, he and some sort of people from the data sciences angle, they forked Pyrex, and they basically created Cython because, he was descending through to that as well. And I sort of always wondered, like, if he keeps descending, eventually he'll be doing microcode architecture for CPUs or whatever. But he stopped there, as far as I know. He's only doing Python, but he's been a very capable maintainer. So I always say that I put LXML in the open source bank, and I'm getting interest on it because people are have added features to it since then. And I still I was using LXML just this week in a project. It's still I still run into it, and I just use it as a library now, but I did create it originally.
It's probably a good feeling, though, to run across other people's projects and go, oh, there it is, yeah.
It's a very good feeling. It's also very useful to say to potential, because I'm a freelancer, so it's very useful to tell Python people that you created LXML, because then, we use that.
Most people know, yeah. Oh, prove to me that you actually know what you're doing. Yeah, that library you're using? Yeah, I wrote that already, so.
Yeah.
Oh, all right then.
So it's, that's pretty neat. Plus, I've been drawing interest on I mean, usually when you have an open source project, you don't really draw interest on it. This is an exception, but there has been features added to LXML, like HTML parsing and all that stuff that I've used in the past that there were just pure interest payments on my initial investment.
Oh, absolutely. Cool. You also did something called Fantastic and Bower Static. What are those two?
Yeah, Fanstatic, actually. Yeah, it's very hard to pronounce.
Yeah, I got to read more carefully.
It's a joke it's a play on words, but it's about those projects came out of something I actually started with Hurry.resource, which was a SOAP project. So what I needed was serve JavaScript files in my application, and those JavaScript files had dependencies, and there was no dependency system for JavaScript. So I created one in Python, and Hurry Resource eventually got sort of renamed Fanstatic and refactored into it. And the idea was to piggyback on Python's packaging infrastructure and Python's dependency infrastructure by just having modules where you declare that you have a JavaScript file or maybe a CSS file, other statics resources, and how they depend on other ones, and then it can automatically generate include statements or generate roll-ups for you in a web page.
Okay. Oh, very nice.
And that's Fanstatic, and it was sort of piggybacking, so you could release like jQuery as a Python package, and then you could just install it like that and start using it, and it would be you'd use it as a WSGI middleware, so you would just insert Fanstatic on top of your web framework, and then inside of your view code you would say, okay, I need this jQuery or whatever, or jQuery UI, and then it would figure out it would need jQuery as well, and then it would just include the right script tags for you automatically. By the middleware would just automatically do that. So that became an open source project a bunch of us worked on. But of course, JavaScript now does have a dependency system. Took a long time, but and a packaging system. So that became,
Bower is one of those, right?
Yeah, Bower is one of those. And, when I started Bower Static, it was basically, okay, I'll just whip up something that's based around Bower because there's a packaging system already there. In some ways, Bower Static is less powerful than Fanstatic, but at least you can install a Bower package. You don't have to wrap all your JavaScript code inside of a Python package and then upload it to PyPy anymore. You can just use the Bower package database. These days, I use Bower less and less as well. I tend to just go for CommonJS packages on NPM and then use the tools that exist for that to package up my JavaScript code. But there are still use cases that Bower Static can solve. They're a little bit harder to solve with those tooling because if you have the use case that you have that's typical for enterprise software, where you have one core application that needs to be deployed in multiple places with particular extensions, and if those extensions are also JavaScript code, bundling everything up for one deployment is not good enough. You would need to do something to bundle up things in pieces, and then if you want to ship them separately, it all becomes pretty hairy because the bundling tool needs to be run sort of at the very end. So for use cases like that, something like Fanstatic or Bower Static is still work better if at least your native enterprise installation system is something like Python packages. So that's a very specific use case.
Those are both really nice touches. All right, so I think I'll have to leave it there for Morepath. We've definitely got into a lot of detail, but I know there's a lot more we could touch on. All right, Martijn, before I let you out of here, how about your favorite editor? When you write some Python code, what do you open up?
I use Emacs. I sometimes try out other editors and then I go back to Emacs. I realize now what it is because I'm not really an Emacs power user. At least that's what I say, but I've been using Emacs so long that I
probably are.
Learn more and more features over the years. But nonetheless, I wouldn't call myself an Emacs power user. But if you use it for 10 years and you learn a few features every year, you do know a bunch of features at the end. But the thing I really like about Emacs is that it just knows how my Python code is supposed to be indented. And if I press tab, it tends to do the right thing. Also in other languages, it indents stuff. And I'm so used to that I tried Atom a while ago and it just didn't do indentation right for my tastes. I could press tab, I could install an extension and then it would let me press tab, but then it would just indent stuff wrong. And then I went back to Emacs again. So yeah, we'll see.
Yeah. All right. Cool. Yeah. There's increasingly more options around the editors that are good, I think. But
yes,
that's cool.
Yes.
And favorite PyPI package? We got 96,000, almost 97,000.
I have trouble deciding. I mean, I like XML, of course, because I mentioned already I'm drawing interest on that one. So maybe I'll just stick to that.
All right.
I use so many, and there are so many very nice ones, but I just can't really think of anyone in particular that stands out.
Sure. It's like, which one of your children do you love the most, huh?
Well, yeah, it's not even my own children, it's other people's children do I love the most.
That's true.
No, there are a lot of nice packages there. Let's see, whatever. I mean, I used Click recently. I like that.
Yeah, that is nice.
That's a nice little library. What else have I used recently? I've been messed around with Numeric and Pandas recently, but I was playing around with developing a data-driven game engine because, why use Numeric and Panda for what they're really for. So I was trying to blast data into OpenGL with Piglet. Piglet is also a very nice library. See, there I remember packages now. So I blast OpenGL data into Piglet coming out of NumPy, I mean, of course, not numeric. So out of NumPy arrays, blast them into OpenGL to try to reduce overhead.
Okay, that's a pretty interesting use case.
Yeah.
All right, awesome. Well, very interesting answers. Okay, so got a final call for action. Like, how do people get started with Morepath? Like, what can they do? What do you need? Do you need contributors? What's on your radar that you'd love to have?
Well, contributors are always great. We have a few core contributors now, which I'm very happy about. And I noticed that if I do like one major outreach thing, like in when I spoke at EuroPython in 2014 for like hundreds of people, one guy started using Morepath and he became a core contributor. So that's just a few core contributors already, such a wealth in an open source project. So those things I like very much. We have a documentation website, morepath.readthedocs.io. There's also a link to a Discord chat, so it just opens in your web browser and you can talk to Morepath developers and other people use Morepath. Create an issue on the issue tracker. That's also a way to reach us. And yeah, I started thinking a little bit about, I was looking at Django a little bit recently, so I started a little bit about trying to create something like the Django admin UI, but then for Morepath using client-side technology somehow, and perhaps using, I've never used it before, but I looked at the Pony ORM, and that looks like a nice ORM, so maybe I'll try that one day.
Yeah, Pony ORM is really nice. I had those guys on the show about 10 weeks ago, and it's really cool.
Yes, yeah.
That's excellent. Everyone get out there and check out Morepath. And Martijn, thank you for being on the show. It was great to talk with you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for letting me talk.
Absolutely. This has been another episode of Talk Python to Me. Today's guest has been Martijn Faassen, and this episode has been sponsored by Metis and Hired. Thank you both for supporting the show. Want to learn data science? Well, don't forget to visit thisismetis.com/talkpython to learn more about their upcoming courses. Get the skills that you need to succeed in the fast-paced world of data science. Hired wants to help you find your next big thing. Visit hired.com/talkpython to me to get 5 or more offers with salary and equity presented right up front and a special listener signing bonus of $2,000. Are you or a colleague trying to learn Python? Have you tried books and videos that just left you bored by covering topics point by point? Well, check out my online course, Python Jumpstart by Building 10 Apps at talkpython.fm/course to experience a more engaging way to learn Python. And if you're looking for something a little more advanced, try my Write Pythonic Code course at talkpython.fm/Pythonic. Be sure to subscribe to the show. Open your favorite podcatcher and search for Python. We should be right at the top. You can also find the iTunes feed at /iTunes, Google Play feed at /play, and direct RSS feed at /RSS on talkpython.fm. Our theme music is Developers, Developers, Developers by Corey Smith, who goes by Smix. Corey just recently started selling his tracks on iTunes, so I recommend you check it out at talkpython.fm/music. You can browse his tracks he has for sale on iTunes and listen to the full-length version of the theme song. This is your host, Michael Kennedy. Thanks so much for listening. I really appreciate it. Smix, let's get out of here.
Stating with my voice, there's no norm that I can feel within. Haven't been sleeping, I've been using lots of rest. I'll pass the mic back to who rocked it best.